It's a real privilege to welcome back an old friend of the Faraday Institute this afternoon, Professor John Wyatt, who has spoken for us many, many times over the years, and indeed not only in this country, but also in a number of other Faraday courses in different parts of the world. We've had wonderful times roaming around in Southeast Asia and China and Hong Kong, a few other places probably, and it's always good to hear John in different contexts. So John Wyatt is Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at University College in London. He's also an honorary consultant neonatologist at University College London Hospitals. And he's been involved with us in the Faraday Institute over the past few years in a really fascinating project to do with research in the area of robotics and intelligence and so forth, and some of the ethical and moral challenges that is arising out of that field. So it's a great joy to welcome Professor Wyatt today, who's going to speak to us on humans, nothing more than machines. Thank you, John. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Dennis, and it's very good to be here to address one of the really burning, I think, issues which our society is facing. My background is as a baby doctor, so you may well ask, what on earth is a baby doctor thinking about artificial intelligence? So for many years I worked as a consultant in a big intensive care unit for babies, and it was really because of my experience working at the cutting edge of medical care, the newborn, was that I became increasingly interested in the ethical challenges of medicine, and in particular the realization that as technology advances, time and time again it asks the question, what does it mean to be human? And how do we understand what it means to be human? And particularly, medicine often seems to ask that question. It seems to take this concept of the human person, and it's almost like it's testing it to destruction. It's taking it to the most extreme cases and asking the question, what is a human? What is a person? And I see the challenges of information technology and rise in AI and robotics as a continuation of that trend. What is happening and what will happen in the future is that question, what does it mean to be human, is going to become more and more an urgent question because of the comparison with advanced intelligent machine intelligence. But I think it's helpful to have a bit of a historical context here, because the truth is that human beings have always understood what it means to be human by reference to the leading technology at the time. So as you look back, you can see that in an age where clockwork technology, and particularly precision clocks, were the most sophisticated kind of human engineering and technology, then lo and behold, the idea that human beings must be some kind of sophisticated kind of clockwork was very current. So this is Denis Diderot in the time of the Enlightenment, talking about human beings. His heart is the mainspring, in his head are the bells, complete little hammers, and the soul is the tiny figure on the top, listening to the music of the chimes. And so this idea of the clockwork human and understandings of humanity in terms of clockwork mechanisms was very common, particularly in the era of the Enlightenment and before then. But then you get the rise of hydraulics and steam power. This is a steam engine, stationary steam engine from the Science Museum. And so people became fascinated with hydraulics. And surprise, surprise, it turned out that the human body must be a system of hydraulics. And it's all about pressures and flows in vessels. And the idea of the circulation, the idea of the lymphatics, the nervous system was thought of again as a sort of basic hydraulic mechanism. And in fact, it's often been suggested that the whole Freudian understanding of the human psychology is really hydraulics. What you've got is this incompressible fluid called libido, and it builds up and it's under pressure, and then it comes bursting out in different kinds of ways. I mean, this is just hydraulics. And surprise, surprise, it turns out that human psychology isn't hydraulics, and is rather different. So we shouldn't be too surprised that here we are in an era where one of the most powerful evidences of modern technology is the supercomputer. And the idea, therefore, that human beings must be computers is an idea whose time has arrived. But again, we should just see the historical context in which that is. It's interesting, in fact, the idea, you can trace it back to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. He wrote his magnum opus called Leviathan, and he has a whole section on human nature. And it includes this interesting passage where he says that reason is nothing but reckoning. It's addition and subtraction. And so he's already started this idea that what's going on in human cognitive processing is a kind of computational activity. I mean, that was very prescient in a time when computation really didn't exist in mechanical computation. But this Hobbesian phrase has been seized on by commentators. And this is Steven Pinker, quoting Thomas Hobbes, says, Thomas Hobbes' pithy equation of reasoning as nothing but reckoning is one of the great ideas of human history. The cognitive feats of the brain can be explained in physical terms. To put it crudely, and critics notwithstanding, we can say that beliefs are a kind of information, thinking is a kind of computation, and motivation is a kind of feedback and control. So there again, the analogy. Now, it's computers which help us to understand cognitive processes. And Pinker goes on, this is a great idea because it completes a naturalistic understanding of the universe, exercising occult souls, spirits, and ghosts in the machine. Just as Darwin made it possible for a thoughtful observer of the natural world to do without creationism, Turing and others made it possible for a thoughtful observer of the cognitive world to do without spiritualism. We don't have to worry about spirits and souls and all that mystical stuff because now we know the brain is just a machine. It's computational. Thinking is computational. And these metaphors are very, very powerful. But it is interesting that some people working in AI and robotics are quite explicit that they believe research in their disciplines is actually going to help us understand what it means to be human. So there's a chap in Osaka in Japan, Professor Ishiguro, who is well known for making robots that are as closely identical with himself or with other human beings. So he is the chap standing up with the glasses and sitting down. Well, they both got glasses. He's the one on top. And sitting down is the robot he's made, who is, to all intents and purposes, looks exactly the same. But it's interesting, when he was asked, what is your aim in creating humanoid robots? He says, one of the major goals of my project is to understand what a human being is like. So there's a genuine desire, I mean, what you could philosophically for self-transcendence, to try and transcend ourselves, to understand what it means to be human. And the way we're going to do that is through research into AI and robotics. Sherry Turkle is a psychotherapist who worked many years at MIT, and she's written some very perceptive criticisms and comments on developments in robotics. But she wrote this: if behind popular fascination with Freudian theory there was a nervous, often guilty preoccupation with the self as sexual, behind increasing interest in computational interpretations of mind is an equally nervous preoccupation with the self as machine. So she's saying the reason there's so much fascination in this computational interpretations of thinking is because there is this sneaking suspicion in the popular mind that actually we might turn out to be machines. The roboticist Rodney Brooks said the brain is just a computer made out of meat. And the argument goes then, why should computers be made out of meat be any more significant than computers made out of silicon. In fact, there's lots of reasons to think that being made out of meat is a distinct disadvantage, and that computers made out of silicon do a whole lot better. So that kind of thinking is absolutely current today. It's everywhere. The more you look for it, this analogy, the brain is just a machine, a computer, and so on. You see that time and time again. But behind it, there lies a very deep philosophical confusion. And I think one of the most important things is to recognize the difference between a useful metaphor and a fundamental description or a definition. So when you say that the brain is a machine, what you're actually doing is you're using a metaphor. You are saying there is something about the brain which is like a machine. That's actually what that phrase is. So there are many aspects of the human brain which are machine-like. But it is both false and incoherent to say that the brain is a machine. Trying to think of an analogy, I was thinking, you could say that a fish is a bit like a submarine made from flesh. It's like a submarine. It's got a control module. It's got a propulsion unit. It's got an ability to stabilize itself in water. So a fish is like a submarine made out of flesh. But to go on and say, actually, that's what it is, a fish is a submarine, is just incoherent, isn't it? It doesn't make any sense at all. What do you mean to say a fish is a submarine? That's as incoherent as it is to say that the brain is a machine. The definition of a machine is it's something created by a human being for a human purpose. That's the definition. That's what it means to be a machine. And yet it's very clear that that's not referring to the human brain. But I think that confusion is around. And to be honest, there are lots of technologists and computer scientists who just don't get that. They just simply don't understand the difference between a metaphor and a description. But I think it is an important problem. The fact, nonetheless, that the brain and the body can be seen as functioning in a machine-like way is very important. And in particular, it means that the body and the brain can be analyzed as though they were machines. One could take many examples of this. I was very struck recently just by seeing some of the potential of modern technology, and that's this device, which is a little computer chip, which uses machine learning techniques, and it's all embedded on a chip, and it's designed to go in a camera, a surveillance camera. But the surveillance camera, that chip has these capabilities for information processing: face detection, face recognition, gender estimation, age estimation, expression estimation, facial pose estimation, gaze estimation, blink estimation, hand detection, human body detection. I just imagine if every single camera on the street, every camera in a home, every camera in a workplace was equipped with these chips, and the capacity for monitoring and for interpreting human behavior, this analytic power that technology gives is absolutely astonishing. And I think this is going to have huge implications for what it means to be human, because I've dubbed this the transparent self. This is taken from a commercial software paper. What it shows is these different emotions here: happy, anger, sadness, disgust, fear, surprise, neutral. And they're being determined in real time from analysis of the facial movements. And so you can see here, second to second, in the emotions of happiness, anger, and sadness. And it's been shown, actually, this technique of monitoring emotions than our own self-monitoring. You may not be aware that you were feeling disgust when you were shown this image, but the machines knew, and they were monitoring it in real time. And so this ability for the technology to invade our consciousness, make us transparent, I think is very, very threatening and challenging. it's interesting that these two writers, Yenker and Andomo, suggested that perhaps we need to create new human rights in an age of neuroscience and neurotechnology. And they, in this paper, 2017, they proposed 4 new human rights. The right to cognitive liberty. In other words, I should be free to think whatever I like and not be coerced in my thinking. The right to mental privacy, that I should have the right to keep my own internal thoughts private. The right to mental integrity, which means the right to have my personality over time not manipulated, that I shouldn't be enforced personality change by outward technology, and the right to psychological continuity, that I should have the right to be the same person all of my lifetime. And again, it may seem bizarre that you need to make these human rights, but this is a response to the potential threats coming from the invasion of humanity and by this new monitoring technology. But about the impact of our own self-understanding as we think about how is being involved in a world which is dominated by intelligent machines, how does that make us think about ourselves? And I think you can see a two-way movement. On the one hand, there's a movement from the machine to the human. In other words, just as we were talking about, we think of ourselves as being mechanisms. We think of ourselves as machine-like. But at the same time, there's a movement from the human onto the machine, and that is we put our own humanity onto the machine. We understand what it means to be an intelligent machine by looking at our own humanity. We project our humanity onto the machine, and that's anthropomorphism. So to put it dramatically, here's the machine and here's the human. The movement this way is the mechanical understanding of what it means to be human. But the movement the other way is anthropomorphism. We put our humanity onto the machine. And anthropomorphism, literally the word is derived from these two Greek words, anthropo, human, morphe, form, and it means literally to see a human form in a non-human being. And it's an incredibly powerful force, which is very much part of our humanity. It's something we do completely unconsciously and without thinking about it. But I think in an age of human-like machines, anthropomorphism becomes a very, very important force, which I think people haven't thought much about what the real significance of this is. So one of the fascinating things is if you were to take some kind of humanoid robot, and it could be something looking almost like a toy or a puppet, or it could be an animal, and do something really unpleasant to it as though you were damaging it or torturing it, you can show that in the human brain are activated the same centers as would have been activated if you were torturing a human being in front of you. And that process happens at an unconscious level. And I think that's going to raise all kinds of difficult ethical questions. So, would it be morally wrong to torture a robot? Not that you're going to do any serious damage to the robot, but is it possible that you're going to do damage to the human being who is doing the torturing or who is watching the torturing? So if you think about it, we have in our Western societies at least very, very strong legislation protecting the rights of kittens, for instance. If you were to abuse a kitten, you could be sent to prison for many years. And now, is this because we believe kittens are so morally important compared to other animals, piglets or rats or cockroaches? Or is it because we have a sense that if we were live in a society where people tortured kittens, that that isn't the kind of society we want to be part of? It says something about the human beings who are torturing the kittens. And I think there's an analogous, there are going to be all sorts of complicated analogous questions about what we do with humanoid robots and how we treat them. There's already evidence, children grow up with robots from a very early age, that it actually, they develop new categories of thinking about these things. So in a 7 to 15-year-olds interacting with a robotic dog, 21% said it was alive, 74% said that it could have feeling, 83% said it could be their friend, and 90% said it would not be all right to destroy the robot dog. And it's interesting that in questioning with children, and Shelley Turkle has done a lot of interesting work in this area, children think it's a kind of new category. They're asked, do you think this thing is alive or not alive? And they say, well, it's kind of in between. It's like, it's half alive. It's as if it was alive. And some people have suggested, therefore, it's almost like they're generating a new ontological category, a new fundamental philosophical category. Between animate and inanimate, there's something else, this new category. It may well be that a generational shift occurs wherein those children who grow up knowing and interacting with lifelike robots will understand them in fundamentally different ways from previous generations. And Sherry Turkle said, the question is not whether children will grow up to love their robots more than other people, but what will loving mean? In other words, our understanding of what it means to love may change if our experience of loving has been so much with robots. So I think the crude idea that we are just machines is something that we get, but nonetheless, the fact that being surrounded by intelligent machines may actually change us in very profound and unpredictable ways, I think that is almost undoubtedly true. And it will be particularly true of generations who grow up. So, for instance, I'm deeply concerned about these chatbots like Alexa, Google Home, which give the impression that you are engaging with a human voice, a human person, who is sassy and knowing and responsive and cute. Humor, but at the time it will do what you want. And other people are investing huge amounts of money. I understand, I read somewhere there were 5,000 AI experts working on Alexa alone. And the reason is they're just trying to do everything they can to make it better, to make it seem more fluent, more human-like, more engaging, more knowing, more responsive, more able to pick up the nuances and so on. And I already heard of a child that were going on holiday, the family were going on holiday, and who said, well, we've got to bring Alexa along because she's part of the family. So you just wonder what is going to happen to children in particular who are brought up with Alexa. It's already raising all kinds of, like, for instance, should you say please and thank you to Alexa? Interestingly, it's a sort of flashback to a previous time in the UK in the 19th century when it was very common in middle-class houses for there to be servants. And a critical question was how the children of the family addressed the servants. Because they're there to do what I want, but they're also human. And therefore I have to treat them with respect and not abuse them, even though they exist. So now what we're creating are these electronic servants. And the question is, what's the etiquette for electronic servants? You treat them with respect and just everything is like, just do it. Okay. So, complex issues. So anthropomorphism is a universal human tendency which is largely outside of our conscious control. It's part of our humanity, it brings profound positive benefits, but at the same time it renders us open to manipulation and deceit. And the manufacturers are deliberately trying to create devices that will encourage that. So for instance, they know that with robots, the best way to get people to engage with robots is to
give them very large appealing eyes, to give them a very large prominent forehead, which is rather like a child's forehead, and to make them behave in childlike ways, because this will then encourage the interaction of the.
I was struck by this comment from a journalist who said, human compassion can be gamed. It's the ultimate psychological hack, a glitch in human response that can be exploited in an attempt to make a sticky product. That's why designers give AIs human characteristics in the first place. They want us to like them. And I think as we look to the forward, we are going to be increasingly surrounded by simulated persons. Some of them are going to be physical and incarnate, if you like these are called Neo robots. Some of them are going to be disembodied voices, like Google Home. Some of them will be images, avatars on the screen. And we're seeing this everywhere. One of the big applications is in mental health. So there's an app which has been developed by psychiatrists and psychotherapists, particularly for helping people with depression. And it's delightfully called the Wobot. And I'm ready to learn 24/7, no couches, no meds, no childhood stuff, just strategies to improve your mood and the occasional dorky joke. And the idea is you'll have this chatty thing on your smartphone which will engage with you every day and help you to analyze your mood and give you strategies and so on. The NHS is investing a lot of money trying to develop smartphone apps which will be used in primary care. And ultimately the goal is to use a smartphone app to replace the GP. So you will address the smartphone app. It will take photographs of you and record your facial movements. It will assess your health. Wearable technology as well to upload data, and then it will diagnose, and then it will send you a QR code for the and then no doubt through Amazon you can have the same day delivery of the drugs or the medication or whatever. And the NHS is genuinely seeing this as a very major advance and is prepared to invest a lot of money in it, particularly in the London area at the moment. They're trying to sign up people for this. And recently Babylon, so the company that's running this is interestingly called Babylon, and it claims that its chatbot beats GPs, that they took the medical exam that GPs have to take and claim that their chatbot did better than the average. There's all kind of other weird things going along. You can upload all your emails and social media and everything from your hard drive up into the cloud. It's then all using machine learning systems. It's all analyzed, and then when you die, it will continue to send emails and social media posts, so you can continue to interact long after you're dead. And this, some people think this seems to be taking on. This is another version like that. This is Replica, which again you upload everything. It becomes your other self, your alter ego. And not so long ago, the BBC had a whole documentary where somebody was talking to her dead friend via the app, and the app responded. So the grey ones is the dead person, and the blue ones are the living one. So I think this kind of confusion and blurring about what it means to be human, what is a person, this is only going to grow and grow, and I think these are all sorts of complexities. A related question is whether or not an artificial intelligence system could ever become conscious, and there's a lot of intense debates, including philosophical discussions going on about this. But I think one of the issues which hasn't been properly thought through is what's known philosophically as the problem of other minds. And that is, that, as is well known, the only consciousness to which you have direct access to is your own. I have absolutely no knowledge of anybody else's consciousness. I have no concept of what it's like to be you. I can try and imagine it, and we give one another the doubt the benefit of the doubt by assuming that what's going on between your ears is something similar to what's going on between my ears. And very interestingly, there's evidence that shows that right from the very beginnings of baby development, the baby is already working on a theory of another mind. It seems as though the idea that there's another consciousness is something that's very fundamental in the process as babies develop, and it may be hardwired into the developing nervous system. But the problem of other minds becomes very, very intense once you have something that is not a human being, and in particular when you have something that is completely alien to our humanity, such as an AI system. So, the point is, therefore, that the only way that you can assess the consciousness, quotes, of a machine is by its behavior, by its responses, its behavioral output. There's absolutely no way that you can get some direct measurement of whether it genuinely is consciousness. And so it's only a matter of time before machines are going to exhibit behavior which appears to represent consciousness. And in fact, arguably, machines like Alexa and so on already do. They already claim some kind of self-awareness and consciousness and a subjective perspective and so on. The problem is, whatever the machines say, we'll never be able to know whether or not it's genuine. But that leads on people to say, therefore we have to give the machines the benefit of the doubt. If it seems to be conscious, already some people are thinking that we're going to have to set up sort of committees of AI experts and neuropsychologists and philosophers, and so that when some software or hardware machine claims consciousness, the committee is going to have to decide whether or not to give this being moral rights. And if you're interested in this, there's a philosopher called Gunkel, David Gunkel, and he's written a whole book on it called The Machine Question. And his narrative is that moral agency starts with rich white European males, and then it gradually expands to include rich white European females, and then non-European males, and then gradually it extends until moral agency now effectively covers all adult human beings. And then it sort of extends to children, and it extends a bit to primates and dolphins, ? But the next thing that's going to happen is moral agency is going to go on to machines. It's going to move. It's the next stage in philosophical and ethical development, he claims. So, thinking now from a Christian perspective, how do we try and get a handle on some of this from a Christian perspective? I've been very influenced by the theology which emerges from the Cappadocian Church Fathers in the 4th century AD. And they were thinking very profoundly about the persons of the Trinity and the nature of the Godhead. And they developed an understanding of the persons of personhood. And it starts with the persons of the Trinity. And they took a Greek word, hypostasis, which originally was an impersonal word. It just meant stuff. And they freighted this word, hypostasis, with new meaning. They said that God consists of 3 hypostases, 3 persons, and that they said these hypostases are in ecstasis. In other words, they're outgoing, they're giving to one another. So the essence of personhood is the self-giving love of the Father, of the persons, the Father giving himself to the Son giving himself to the Father, and so on. So it's a very particular Christian and Trinitarian understanding of personhood. Interestingly, it is claimed the ancient Greek and Roman world didn't have the concept of the person. They understood the persona, which was the social mask, the face you present in society. But the idea that there might be a continuing person underneath the mask was actually alien to the ancient world. That concept was invented by Christians, and it was invented by Christian theologians to describe what the nature of the Trinity. So the very concept of the personhood, emerges out of Christian theology. And so from this way of understanding is the idea that personhood is a category of reality which is ontologically foundational. In other words, you cannot define a person in terms of something more basic. To be a person is the most basic level of reality. Persons are not reducible to matter and energy, and they're not limited to matter and energy. And persons are constituted by their relations. Their being is derived from the movement of communion, from the freedom to give oneself to the other in self-giving love. And so this is a very exalted view of being a person. To be a person is to participate in some sense in the divine life of the triune God. And I've been grappling with some deep philosophy about personhood and the ontology of persons. And what emerges is that there are two basic understandings of how a person emerges. And one is this is the dominant understanding in Western philosophy. And it's what's been called a substantialist ontology. And the idea is that the most fundamental level is stuff, impersonal stuff, which is sometimes called substance or essence or being, that somehow the person emerges from stuff, and then ultimately, once a person has emerged, they reach out and make communication with other persons. But the most fundamental level is down here. So the most fundamental level is impersonal. The person emerges out of the impersonal, and then the interpersonal emerges out of the personal. And if you apply that to the human person, you have the same thing. So there is this impersonal stuff of human nature, there is the person of the individual human, and then there are human relationships. If you put that in an emergent physicalist view, then what happens is that the most basic stuff is physics. It's the fundamental particles and forces. An emergent person emerges out of here, and then you end up with the interpersonal. But if you take the Trinitarian understanding of persons, interestingly, it completely inverts it. Because what it puts is it puts the interpersonal as the most foundational level of reality. It says, and if you think about it, from an Orthodox Christian point of view, that makes total sense, because what comes first, persons or stuff? And the answer is, it's absolutely clear. It's the persons of the Trinity who come first, and the stuff of the cosmos emerges from personhood. So persons are more foundational than stuff. And in particular, divine persons in community, the argument is that the divine essence emerges from the persons. And if you then try, and this is that somehow our human personhood comes from the divine personhood. And that is the foundational part of what it means to be human. I mean, to put this in a very trite way, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, putting the whole focus on human consciousness. But this kind of Trinitarian ontology says, you love me, therefore I am. It's a thing about yous and me's. The most foundational thing of us is to do with love between persons. And of course, if you have why is this relevant to this talk? Well, the reason it's relevant is that if you buy into this kind of substantialist ontology of a human person, you have to say, in principle, it could happen in the machine. Because we start with physics, and silicon, and from silicon emerges some kind of person, and from the emergent person, we could then have relationship with the machine. So a substantialist ontology opens us to the possibility of personhood emerging out of silicon. Whereas if you take this understanding of personhood, our personhood is a gift from the triune God. It isn't an emergent phenomenon, and therefore personhood really can only occur if God chooses to make the gift. That means, of course, it's possible that God might choose to give a gift of personhood to a computer, much as he's chosen to give it to a carbon-based life form like us. But that's his priority. It's not something that emerges in a natural way. Just finally, I think there's another deep point which comes from Christian theology, and that is the distinction between beings that are born and beings that are made. So in the Nicene Creed, the Church Fathers wrestle to try to describe the relationship between God the Son and God the Father, and they ask the question, was the Son created by God the Father in the same way that the world was created? And they said, no, God the Son was begotten or born from the Father, not made, whereas the creation is made. And what they're doing is making a distinction, an important distinction, that which we give birth to is fundamentally the same as us. It shares our nature. And so if we think it in our own human understanding, our children come as a gift from our being, and they're equal to us in status and dignity. We care for and nurture and educate our children, but we cannot control them, and we cannot determine their nature. We can't say what they are for. But that which we make or create is fundamentally different from us. It is a product of our will, and it's therefore ours to mold and control. We can determine what is it for and what it will do. And so I think that distinction, that we beget our children, but we make computers. And however much they will behave as though they were people, that distinction between beings who are born and beings who are made does seem to me a pretty fundamental distinction. And a related distinction, and this really comes from the work of Martin Buber, an existentialist philosopher from a Jewish background, who wrote a famous book in German, Ich und Du, I and Thou. And he talked about you relations and I-it relations, and described in fascinating detail the differences between an I-you and I-it relationships. And interesting makes the point, again, that in human development, it's the I-you relationships which come first. The baby discovers the other of the mother or the caregiver before it's discovering I-it relationships. The first thing that the baby does is to reach out for another human. And so the I-you relationship is primary in human development. It comes before the I-it relationship. And I think the challenge for us is that the machines that simulate humanity are only its. They're only machines, but they will feel as though they're a you. So in other words, this distinction will be increasingly blurred by human-like machines and by simulated relationships. So to summarize, intelligent machines will increasingly play a role as simulated or analogous persons in interactions with humans, but they cannot share our human nature as authentic persons who are called to union and communion. They cannot participate in genuine I-you relations. Orthodox Christianity theology highlights an important distinction between beings who are born and those who are made, and this distinction may become increasingly important as we're surrounded by machines that simulate human behavior, relationality, and personhood. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Professor. We're listening to you with big pleasure. I want to ask you, do you know about test Turing test?
Yes.
And you know, I know about it, about the idea of transhumanism. It is reality or only modern mythos?
Thanks very much. That's a good question. So the question was, first of all, about the Turing test, which famous test that Alan Turing suggested, which was that, I mean, originally the idea was with teletype machines, and that you had, interestingly, it started with a man and a woman, two teletype machines, and the question was whether you could tell the difference between the man and the woman just by seeing their responses. And then it developed it, if it was a man and a machine, could you tell the difference between the man and the machine? And I think there's been a lot of focus on the Turing test. I think it's not a very helpful test as we look towards the look forward, principally because it's all based on deception. And I mean, there are real-life Turing tests. There's a thing called the Loebner Prize, which looks at where the prize of money is made. If you can make a computer which can fool the judges, they have some real human beings, they have some computer programs, and they try to fool the judge. But the way they do it is by adopting the persona of a sort of adolescent with a psychosis. And, you know, because that then sort of, it becomes harder and harder to work out whether this really is, or with sort of autism, you know, as well. So I don't think the Turing test in its original form is very helpful, but I do think this idea that there is a sort of blurring between what is human and what is simulated, I think that is very relevant and important. And one of the interesting ideas I've just come across is it's called a Turing red flag. And the idea is that whenever there's a machine which is attempting to fool us, which is attempting to pretend to be human, and that could be a chatbot, it could be a robot, it could be an avatar, whatever, that by law it should be obliged to state that it's not a human, and that it should be enforced by criminal law, much like, you know, there are laws that say if you go onto a website, it has to tell you if there are cookies, or it has to ask your permission to change your computer. So then transhumanism, yeah. So the other question was about transhumanism. Is this science fiction or is it reality? Well, it's reality. There's no doubt that there is a very strong push to try to enhance the human body into new and non-human capabilities. And in fact, if you think about it, cosmetic surgery is a low-tech version of transhumanism, of trying to model the human body. And there are many other examples of that. I think it's going to become more and more powerful and effective. Elon Musk, the well-known entrepreneur, he has taken an idea from science fiction, which is to implant underneath the skull a network of electrodes, a very fine mesh which goes right over the cortex. And he got that idea from a science fiction novel, and it was called Neural Lace. And he's set up a company to create neural lace to make this, and this could then give very high bandwidth communication with computers. So there's no doubt it's coming. However, I personally think that this human enhancement will come very slowly. And the reason for that is it's extraordinarily expensive. So to create a new piece of medical equipment can cost hundreds of millions of dollars and may take 5 or 10 years of testing because of safety concerns. Same with creating new drugs or new medical equipment. So it's coming very slowly because of all the technical challenges and risks of actually inserting things into the human body. Whereas the artificial intelligence, the pure disembodied version, is coming very fast because it doesn't have any of those restrictions. It's possible to create new programs, very rapidly. It's possible to disseminate them around the world. So I think the real threat is not from the physical modification of the body. It's from this interaction with highly sophisticated artificial intelligence and robotic systems.
Thank you, Professor. And I really love that you used the Trinitarian anthropology to conclude your speech. And And I would like to ask some about I and thou and I and it relationship, because seems in your discourse you seems that we should be stray away from the worry that the robot will become human, because he is a creation of us, and the it cannot be becoming to thou, because the essence of it is a robot. But in the Martin Buber thinking, he's talking about the I and thou and I and it is a twofold of the world that this is I don't know how to use the word. He used poetic language, but I may use the word choose. You choose to see the person as it, then it become your tool, and you see the person as person, then it become thou.
Yes.
So the problem is not essentially it is a robot or not, but the problem is whether the robot which is very similar to a human, the real human, will they treat forcefully them as a robot? Because it really happens in some East Asia country, like Japan. Yes, they will marry robot or marry some doll.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the most important worry is like this. How do you respond to that?
No, thanks very much. I think you're right. Certainly, in a way, I'm trying to say the same thing. I think that, in other words, the threat is not at an ontological level. It's not fundamentally about being, because these things are machines. The threat, if you like, is more at an epistemological level. It's how I think about this and how I can know what this thing is. And I think this is important, because I think Christians tend to focus on ontology. They tend to think just at the sort of basic level of being, whereas the real issue, as you say, is that I can treat this thing as though it was a person. I can get married to it. I can have relationships with it. One of the interesting things is that in the technical world, in places like Silicon Valley and so on, it's a bit of a caricature, but I think it is generally true that what I would call an instrumentalist understanding of relationships is very common. In other words, what are relationships for? Well, relationships are just to make me feel good. They give me some kind of warmth, some kind of satisfaction, some kind of meaning. That's what a relationship is for. So if I interact with this robot and it makes me feel good and it gives me this warmth, well, it's fine. It's a relationship. What's the problem? It's a kind of nerd's view of the universe. But unfortunately, the nerd's view of the universe is now becoming dominant, because the nerds are ruling the universe. At least they think they are. And so this very superficial, instrumental understanding of relationships is being disseminated and promoted, often for commercial reasons. And I think that's a real threat. And that's why, again, we need to recover this deeper understanding. That's where I see the Trinitarian understanding of self-giving, the mystery of union and communion. It's a much deeper and a thicker understanding of human relationships.
Well, thank you. And I gotta admit, I am kind of afraid now after your talk.
Good.
So my question for you is, what should we do? What's to not go into this path? Should we stop making AIs, or is there a way for us to treat them? What should we do?
It's a very good question, and I think we all need to wake up and smell the coffee. Is what I would, my intention is to try and make you a little afraid, because at the moment I don't think people, particularly religious or Christian people, I don't think they are thinking much about these issues. And I think this is an urgent thing which we need to think how to push back. I think clearly the answer is not to take a sort of Luddite position and just say all technology is evil and bad and we're not going to have anything to do with it. The Luddites were in the Industrial Revolution. at the time when jobs were being displaced by the new machines in the mills. The Luddites were a group who took to wrecking the machines in order to try and protest against mechanization, and the idea being to protect their own jobs. To what extent that's a real historical thing and to what extent it's a bit of a historical myth is another question, but nonetheless that's how Luddites are used. I don't think that is an option, and I think there are some very positive benefits that can come from AI in lots of fields, not least medical diagnosis, for instance, where AI offers some really powerful new technology. But I do think we are going to need to find ways of defending human embodiment, defending the goodness of the body. And one of the things I'm starting to realize, and this really will be another talk, and that is that a major problem in the whole digital world is disembodiment. It's the idea, because once you think about information and the transfer of information and the analysis of information, you've extracted all the bodily elements and you've made it this pure, disembodied reality. And it's interesting, isn't it, how often digital communications lead to miscommunication. Why is it that social media connections so often leads to miscommunication, violence, anger, deception, all these kind of things? Why does that happen? Well, I think a major reason it happens is that in electronic communication, you take away all the embodiment. It's become this disembodied reality. And once things become disembodied, you lose the richness of what it means to be human. And also, interestingly, it seems you expose ourselves to evil. I think evil can function in a disembodied way. And I've started to see links with ancient Gnosticism, which was an ancient Christian heresy, which taught that the material world and the material body was intrinsically evil, and that what you had to do was to escape from the body into this pure spiritual realm. And the interesting thing is that the early church fathers saw Gnosticism as a very major threat, and they attacked it very vigorously. And what they attacked it with was the goodness of the body. The human body was not an evil, entrapping thing. It was actually something profoundly good, although fallen, and they pointed to the incarnation as evidence of the goodness of the bodily creation. I just wonder whether this sort of new form of Gnosticism, which is emphasizing this disembodied communication, and whether as Christians we must reassert the doctrine of the body, the goodness of bodily communication, of bodily relationships. And I just wonder, there's a campaign in Britain which is called CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, or real beer. I wonder whether in the future we're going to have a campaign for real humanity, and say that actually human interaction, human relationships, human face-to-face contact, these are the really important things. And to push back against the dominance of the digital.
Fantastic, thank you for that. What are the implications for the people in our society who have disabilities, who can't compete, who aren't perfect? Do you see a movement towards a eugenics or a more of a marginalisation of those who can't compete?
Thanks, that's a really interesting question. Well, and as so often in the modern world, it's very, very complicated. That trend is definitely there. Many they feel that they are being discriminated against. For instance, they feel very, very strongly about prenatal diagnosis and screening because they feel this is a kind of societal way of getting rid of people like me. And so there is definitely that movement. But on the other hand, you have to say that sometimes the technology is a very powerful means of empowerment for people with disabilities, because it allows somebody who's maybe has a very restricted physical movement, perhaps in a wheelchair, to actually find ways of freedom and interaction and engagement and overcome some of the disabilities. So, as so often in the modern world, these things are not right. You know, there are complex, and so I think what we need is discernment to try to focus on the things that are really positive and helpful, but to push back where we see negative and particularly dehumanizing and disembodying ways. So, unfortunately, there are various forms of modern Christianity which tend towards Gnosticism already. They downplay the body, they emphasize the spiritual, they have a sort of very negative view of disembodiment. And that kind of Christianity is really going to struggle against the new AI challenges. So we need to recover this robust understanding of the goodness of the body, I think, and of the physical.
My question is, as someone who pays really close attention to all of these things that some of us are unaware of, do you feel that, I'm sure it varies country by country, but do you feel that we are having the necessary philosophical and ethical conversations? It seems that sometimes with science we plow forward without having the ethical conversations.
Yes, thanks very much. I think what's emerging is that there are two massive AI superpowers are emerging. And one of them is in the States. The States is already dominant in this area, but is going to become increasingly dominant. But the other one is in China. And China is going to be, many people predict that ultimately China is going to be more advanced in AI than the States and will become the dominant AI superpower. And what's interesting is if you look at what's driving these two things, there's not much to choose between them. In America, it's principally being driven by old-fashioned capitalism and commercial forces. It's all about maximizing shareholder value. In China, it's all being driven by the Communist Party as a way of exerting totalitarian control over 1 billion people. And it's not a very nice choice, really. Which do you think is better? You know that, but therefore, I think it's very unlikely that serious governance and control is going to come from either the States or China. And interestingly, that creates a special role for Europe. And that Europe, although it's not a technical superpower, it does have the skills and knowledge and history and track record to actually develop new regulatory frameworks. And interestingly, within Europe, it seems that the UK is probably the leading place where this conversation is going on. There are lots of think tanks and other activity going on, including in government and so on, actively discussing some of these issues. So, I mean, it's interesting that just for such a time as this, we happen to be in a good place, certainly if you come from Europe or the UK. But of course, these are global conversations that we can all be involved in. And I'm not pessimistic. I think there could be real opportunities to develop new regulatory frameworks which could start in Europe, but which could then spread out around the world, and as a way of pushing back against this. And an example is GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. That started as a European initiative that said that digital companies would have to ask permission before they use our data. But the interesting thing is that all the big international companies have adopted GDPR globally, because they say, well, we're going to have to do this in Europe, so we might as well do it in the rest of the world. So it just shows how a European initiative can actually really change practice across the world. And I hope there will be more, including possibly this Turing red flag, for instance. But there are other ideas for regulatory control. Another idea I like is the idea that wherever there's an AI or digital service which is funded by adverts, which of course is what advertising, what's true for all Google and Amazon and everything else, is all funded by advertising, there should be by law that the company has also to produce a similar quality product which is to be a paid-for service, but which guarantees complete privacy and freedom from adverts. And I think many people would be prepared to pay for a completely private Gmail, even if it was a few dollars a month. And similarly for other social media services, like a paid-for Facebook or a paid-for Twitter. Or, I think, in other words, we don't have to accept that the advertising model is the only way that these companies can function.
Thank you. I love your idea that you give a theological resources to build AI as a person. But I would like to know more, what is the theological implication after we view them as person, especially on our understanding on creation and salvation?
I didn't quite get that, I'm sorry. What are the theological implications?
Yeah. If we agree that AI is has personhood, what is the theological for
Thanks
creation
very much.
and
Well, I think you won't be surprised to feel that I don't think we should give AI's personhood, and I don't believe that certainly in the foreseeable future that we should treat an AI as a person. I think if we did, it does raise huge questions about, for instance, the nature of freedom. Should we allow a machine to choose what it does with its time, to choose how it behaves? Because if it's a person, then part of the fundamental definition of what it means to be a person is to be free. And that's part of what the Trinitarians said. They said the Father is free to give himself to the Son. The Son is free to respond to the Father. And because we are persons, we are free to respond to God's love. So freedom is part of being a person. But the implications of saying that we allow this new being to behave freely, I think will raise all kinds of challenges and questions. It also means part of freedom is also responsibility. We hold human beings responsible for their actions. They are accountable. And if they do something which we believe is wrong, we also believe that some form of accountability, possibly some kind of punishment or restriction, is appropriate. Now, what would we say about a machine? Is a machine responsible for its actions? What would it mean to punish a machine? What would it mean to hold a machine accountable? Again, you can just see the confusion and the difficulties. So I think we should really strongly resist this. I think it will only lead down a very difficult and confusing path.
Right, okay. Thank you ever so much for that wonderful thing. Many years ago, Asimov had his 3 rules of robotics.
Yeah.
Would that be a good attempt to make? If so, what would they be, and who might make the laws?
Yeah, thanks very much. Very good question. So Asimov was a science fiction writer, and he wrote a whole series of books on robotics, and he invented these 3 rules of robotics. And if you know the stories, what you know is that the plots of the stories is how these rules interacted in all kinds of unforeseeable and complicated ways. So the whole stories were really to demonstrate how taking those rules, which seem so obvious, actually have all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So there is very active research and interest in this thing. Can we develop some kind of code of ethics for an autonomous system? Would it be some kind of lookup table? Would there be some kind of algorithmic principles? And surprise, surprise, people are concluding it's fearsomely difficult, if not impossible. Because it turns out, surprise, surprise, morality is not algorithmic. And, the way we understand right and wrong is so much more rich and complex and nuanced, and trying to teach a machine a human understanding of what is right and wrong. Interestingly, many people have therefore have abandoned that. And now what they're focusing on is what they call norms, which I think is quite dangerous. But what there's, in other words, let's not think about right and wrong. Let's think about what normally human beings do in this situation. Let's try and understand the norms, and then let's try and get the computers to follow human norms. But I think, I mean, that may be easier to program, but you can immediately see the dangers and the challenges. Interestingly, another approach, so in ethics, is utilitarianism, which is what you do is you look at the consequences of the action. So the idea is that there's a continuous calculus going on in the autonomous system, which is trying to work out what the consequences would be of every single action. But again, the problem with utilitarianism is that you get a sort of runaway. The size of the problem escalates to infinity very rapidly because of all the number of permutations and combinations. So again, I think it turns out that morality is not algorithmic. So this is a huge problem, and a very real problem. As autonomous systems are being developed, how can they be controlled? Very, very major problem in missile systems, in autonomous weapons. And there's a ferocious debate going on at the moment about whether or not autonomous weapons should be there. I'm afraid there is little doubt that they are already there, and they are going to be developed very rapidly. And surprise, surprise, China is one of the places that is investing huge resources in developing autonomous weapon systems.